We used to think, oh, we should avoid fatty foods, or we should avoid saturated fats, or we should avoid meat, but really we need to avoid inflammatory foods, and sugar is number one. Studies were done with sugar that showed that sugar can have a 30% increased risk of heart disease. Heart disease is our number one killer in the United States. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Good Gut Feeling podcast, where we digest modern medicine with old world wisdom. Another exciting topic this week to help us understand what foods we should eat and what foods we should avoid. Foods that may affect our health in a negative way that we may not even know about. Today, we're going to talk about the top 4 foods which may be harming your health. Before we get started, before we dive right in, just a quick order of business. This episode and all our prior episodes and all our future episodes are for educational purposes only, and they don't take the advice of your doctor. Let's get started. Let's get started with foods that we may not want to eat because they may negatively affect our health. Now remember, I truly believe this, that any natural foods in their pure state are good for us in certain amounts at certain times and in certain periods of our life. There's no inherently bad natural food that exists in its proper state. Sometimes we don't need to be eating it because it's not what we need, but it's not necessarily bad. Most of the bad foods, unfortunately, are because of tampering by man. So we're going to talk about the top 4 foods that may be toxic for your health. Number 1, and I think you guys can guess this, that is sugar. Now, sugar is a very broad term. It's a very broad term because sugar exists in the natural state in fruit. Many foods have sugar naturally in it. However, we're talking about processed sugar, cane sugar, that we add to our foods or that is added to some of our processed foods like cookies, candies, candy bars, etc. Sugar is probably the number 1 toxic food. It's probably the number 1 abused food because it is addictive. And unfortunately, our kids are eating it so much in candies, in different types of sugary snacks, ice cream, popsicles, you name it. It's everywhere. And unfortunately, we see so many children that can't focus in school, that are hyperactive. And I wonder how much of this is related to their sugar intake. But the truth is it affects adults. And everything that affects adults affects children in a greater way. So what is the problem with sugar? Sugar is inflammatory. Basically, the way sugar is metabolized, it creates an inflammatory cascade that actually creates inflammation in the body. This can create inflammation in the liver and make someone predisposed to something called fatty liver. Fatty liver doesn't sound so bad, but it actually looks very similar to alcoholic liver disease, and in fact can cause end-stage liver disease such as cirrhosis, and is now one of the most common causes. Studies were done with sugar that showed that sugar can have a 30% increased risk of heart disease. Heart disease is our number 1 killer in the United States. We used to think, oh, we should avoid fatty foods, or we should avoid saturated fats, or we should avoid meat, but really we need to avoid inflammatory foods, and sugar is number 1. So what can you eat? Let's say you like sweet things. What are great options? Number 1, if you want to add sugar to something or to bake with something, we can use maple syrup, we can use raw honey, date sugar, coconut sugar, all better versions. No, we should not be eating a ton of sugar in any form. However, small amounts of sugar in a good form usually are not a problem at all. The problem is when we start using processed sugars and when we use a lot. So we want to use smaller amounts. Sugars found in fruit. Yes, fruit has a lot of sugar. However, fruit is balanced by the fiber in the fruit. So if we have pear, for example, which is a high sugar fruit, we have a lot of fiber that balances out. Now, if we have pear juice or orange juice or apple juice, that's a totally different story because now we get the concentrated sugar with no fiber, and that's not good. So fruit juice generally is not good, but a fruit smoothie would be good because then you basically liquefy the fruit, but you also get the fiber. So if you want sweet things, eat fruit smoothies. If you want to get like a frozen treat, you can make a smoothie, stick a popsicle stick into it, and stick it in the freezer, and you have a delicious, no sugar added, naturally occurring sugar in the fruit popsicle. So many great ways that we can even eat sweeter things, although obviously in moderate amounts, and still not have the toxic effects of processed sugar. Number 2, foods that we may want to avoid or at least decrease are seed oils. Seed oils and vegetable oils. Oils like canola oil, like corn oil, like safflower oil or sunflower oil, for example. The seed oils have a higher ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids. Now, we need both, actually. Both are important for our health. However, the ideal ratio is higher omega-3. So the oils that were better for us are the ones that have a ratio of higher omega-3 to omega-6. Another problem with these seed oils is in order to create the oil, these seeds are heated at a very high temperature, which actually makes a toxic product. So what can we use? What can we use instead of the seed oils? So for high heat cooking, best oils to use are avocado oil and coconut oil. Now there have been some controversies with avocado oil, that some of the avocado oils are actually mixed with seed oils, because seed oils are less expensive, they're degraded with seed oil. So look for an avocado oil that says 100% avocado oil. For baking, you can use olive oil. Olive oil also has a good ratio. It's not great at the higher heats. Same thing with olive oil, you want it to say 100% olive oil because it can also be degraded. With seed oils and not listed on the ingredients, you want it to say 100% olive oil. And those are great oils for cooking. You don't really need the seed oils. Avocado oil in particular is a very neutral tasting oil. So olive oil does have a taste, coconut oil does have a taste, but avocado oil doesn't. So if you're looking for a neutral oil to bake with, for example, you don't like the coconut flavor for baking, avocado oil is a great and healthy oil as long as it's 100% avocado. Number 3 is gluten. And gluten has a bad rep, but there's a reason for it. And it's not that all wheat is bad. It's really what we did with the wheat in the United States. If you compare the wheat in Europe to the wheat in the United States, it's different. It's different. And there are many people, and a number of them are my patients, who travel to Europe and have no problem with their breads and their pastries and their pastas, and then come to America and come back and have problems. And the same thing vice versa. People who moved from Italy, for example, who ate a ton of wheat products in the form of pasta and breads, came here and got sick from the breads. Our wheat is genetically different. Our wheat is unfortunately genetically hybridized, which is different from genetically modified. So it's not listed as GMO. The genetically modified means that the genes are actually tampered with in a lab, whereas genetic hybridization means they bred 2 different plants together to get a certain characteristic. So what they did is they took the American wheat plants, which were tall and skinny plants that were more susceptible to weather conditions, less resilient, and they bred them with a dwarf Japanese grass. And that created a much shorter wheat and more chubby wheat. So that wheat was more productive, it's more resilient. So most of our commercial wheat is from that genetically hybridized dwarf wheat. So now we have a genetically altered product through hybridization. So just because something says non-GMO, it doesn't mean that it's not genetically hybridized. Genetically hybridized is typically not stated anywhere. The second thing is that American wheat is typically a type of wheat that has higher gluten than European wheat. And the third reason is that we typically use glyphosate in commercial farming with wheat, where it's outlawed in many places in Europe. So how can we eat wheat and still be healthy? So there are much better versions of wheat that are either less tampered with regards to hybridization, or supposedly not at all hybridized. And those are the ancient wheat grains. For example, number 1, my top favorite ancient wheat grain is einkorn. Number one is einkorn. Einkorn is heavier in protein, lower in gluten, and reports that there's never been hybridized. So when you eat einkorn, it actually tastes different. It's baked differently because the gluten in the bread actually is what gives it structure. So it's a little more finicky. So those are better versions of wheat that we can eat. Another issue with European wheat versus American wheat is that our wheat is fortified with iron, and that iron is not so digestible. Unfortunately, even European wheat that is imported into the United States is fortified, and many times we have problems with that fortification. And finally, one important thing is, how is the bread made? So to the best way is the old-fashioned way, slow fermentation, which is basically sourdough. Sourdough allows the wheat to ferment and creates good enzymes that help the digestive process, whereas most of our commercial wheat uses an instant fast type yeast, which does not allow the enzymes to form and allow the bread to be much more digestible. So if you take an einkorn sourdough that's baked with really only 3 ingredients, you should have flour, water, and a little bit of salt. Those are the only ingredients really needed for sourdough. And then you compare that to wheat found in the store, regular commercial wheat bread. Those are 2 different products. They're both called bread, but they're completely different with regards to your health. And number 4 product, which exists in its natural form in its perfect state, but unfortunately has been tampered with in the United States, and that is dairy. And there are better forms of dairy, and dairy is a problem on multiple levels with regards to commercially produced dairy. Number 1 is that the animals are generally not healthy. So we're getting generally commercial dairy farming. We're getting cows that are sick, that are eating GMO corn, that aren't, walking around and grazing properly. That's number 1. Number 2 is how the milk is actually processed in order to get on our shelves. Most states have outlawed raw milk. There's very few states that actually allow raw milk legally. So what happens in the milk process? So number 1, we get this milk typically from an unhealthy cow that ate GMO food its whole life, may have been injected with hormones, antibiotics, et cetera, and now we get its milk. Now the milk gets homogenized, which means under pressure and heat, the milk is processed to make the globules smaller. And why would that be done? Basically, the milk in its whole form is very fatty. And the way that milk was sold years ago in the United States is you would get a jar and you would look at the milk, the fat layer would be on top, and you would get a milk that's not totally consistent. And now the commercial dairy companies are using different fat concentrations for different products. For example, the highest fat may be used for butter, cream, etc. The homogenization allows the milk to be broken down by fat content. You can separate the milk into whole milk, skim milk, 2% milk, and the milk is more consistent. It also becomes pasteurized. Pasteurized is a higher heat process that is used to prevent contamination. Now, what is the problem with this process? The problem is, number 1, we're killing the good enzymes because those enzymes help us digest the milk. So we're seeing so many people with lactose intolerance. One of the problems could be the milk is actually lacking the proper enzymes. Some studies have even suggested that milk can cause clogging of the arteries. But I have seen this very clearly in my practice. Dairy can trigger so many people with Crohn's, with ulcerative colitis, with IBS, and even perfectly healthy people can have problems from just using commercial milk. Raw milk is available in very few states, and for those who have ever tried it, it tastes totally different. So raw milk is the milk that you squeeze out of the cow. It has a different taste, it has a different consistency, it has a different fat content. It tastes like a completely different product. So what man has done is created a milk that does not exist in nature. We see a trend here. How it exists in nature, good. How man processes it is bad. So we still always come back to the same rule. If it exists in nature in some way, it's probably okay for us to eat it in some amounts, in some time, and in some point in our life. Once man tampers with it, can't predict. Our food system is now so complex. There's so many good things. There's so many bad things. We have so much information out there. What's real, what's not real. Basic concept. Eat whole foods. Eat high quality foods. Try to avoid chemicals in your food. Try to avoid ingredients in your food you can't pronounce. And you'll be probably pretty good. Pretty good. We have to be vigilant, but it's worth it because our health is on the line. Thank you, everybody. Stay healthy, stay gutsy. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe. And also, please find lots of content, more gut health content on our website at wholegut.com. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.